Now, when I do this, can you still see me? Maybe not.
No, we can see you.
Okay, you can see me the whole time? Okay, thanks. Okay, there's some lag here. Good morning.
Good morning.
I was going to give it one more minute. I have not heard back from Andrea or Sophia, so I'm not sure what's going on there. I did hear from Andrea last week that he's still in country, but I am recording these, so hopefully everybody will get to see them at some point. And of course, you can use them at any time if you wish to go back and look at the recordings. So what I'm going to do today is I have some midterm questions to go over. I'm looking to have Kyle scan the your midterms that you did before the break, so I can email those to you, but he's mostly working from home, so that may take a little while. Grades on those were obviously all over the place, not surprisingly. You know, and you've all gotten, I assume at this point, it would probably help too. Use the text thing, the chat window, to ask questions as we go along, so I can sort of see those, and I can. I think it'll just be more straightforward rather than having everybody trying to talk over each other. And what? Oh, right. So go over the midterm, and then I'm going to talk about Griswold today and culture and identity and social movement issues. And then on Wednesday, I forget who's presenting on Wednesday. Let me look this up. Hold on. Okay, so Wednesday is the See Me article, and I believe that was supposed to be Sophia, and right, that is supposed to be Sophia, and hopefully she is back in contact with us by then. If not, I'll be prepared to talk about that on Wednesday. Do you all basically understand, though, that the revised schedule and the days that you signed up to present, the dates are wrong, but the articles are right? Does that make sense? Okay, thank you, Joelle. Okay, good. All right then, just about the midterm then. So yeah, response is really all over the place, and I'm not at all surprised about that, given what everybody's been going through. Again, I would point you to the email from the dean from, I think, last week. If you want to think about doing the class as credit, no credit, that's fine. If you want to take it for whatever letter grade you get, that's fine. Just be in touch with me about that as we go along. And I think they're giving you till a few weeks from now to have to make those decisions. Any way you take it, I would just say getting the credit, hanging with it and getting credit for the class at this point. Oh, May 8th. Okay. Yeah. So right till basically everything's over. I think though, in general, better to get some credit than to make the semester a total wash. And if your grades aren't great, or if you do take just credit, no credit, I don't think anybody's going to hold anything against you for whatever happened in 2020. Again, don't worry about it. Try to salvage what you can of the semester, and we'll keep going forward. And I'm going to keep trying to teach, and we'll see how this works. If you have suggestions, if you have issues with using the Google Meet, please let me know. You should be able to see somewhere in your oops, where does it go? In your Google Meet windows here, right? If you click on in the bottom left-hand corner of your window, you'll see an opportunity. If you click on "You," it says what you can turn on. You can turn on captions. Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, nice. Okay, you can turn on or off the closed captions. You can also present a button to present now. You can press a button to present now, and that will allow you to show the rest of us what's on your screens at home. So if you want to use PowerPoints or something like that going ahead when you do your presentations for the class, that's grand, not required. However you want to do those presentations going forward is obviously great. Okay, are there any, let me open the chat window back up. Are there any questions? Okay, cool. Then I will proceed just quickly going over the midterms, the short responses. First question was, identify two of the filters that Fine believes a cultural object must pass through. And I think most folks had a pretty good handle on that. Again, this is this idea of what kinds of things are become part of a small group's culture. The Little Leaguers was his example, but things, whether it's something that's known, whether it's understood, acceptable in the cultural milieu, etc. You had a pretty good handle on that. Then what's the difference in Swidler's view between the use of culture in settled versus unsettled times? That was kind of, responses were all over the place on that. The big thing to remember here is that the Swidler's position is that in unsettled times, people are more reflexive about their culture. They're more explicit in using culture and having to sort of reform, what does, I'm sure you're having some issues right now, what does family mean now that you're locked in with your family 24 hours a day? presumably we're getting people thinking about, well, what does that mean? We're having, I don't know if you're reading this stuff or if you're avoiding it, discussions about what does social contact mean? What are the importances of our relationships, etc. Normally, again, we don't think about that in settled times. Now that we're in unsettled times, all of that's much more explicit and worried about and discussed and debated. And again, if you have questions, just put stuff in the chat window and I will answer questions. Question 3, the four corners of Griswold's cultural diamond. Everybody was good on that. You got the object, the social world, producers and receivers. One reason, the question 4 was one reason Becker says some people who use marijuana don't become regular users. If you recall that article, you had to learn to enjoy the high. You had to learn what the effects were. You had to learn how to properly smoke, et cetera, et cetera. If you didn't do those, you didn't follow all the steps, you wouldn't become a regular marijuana user. And again, also remember that the point isn't necessarily with that article necessarily that I want you to know how to use marijuana, but again, to know how cultural learning happens, how we sort of progress from one thing to another, but also in a really broad sense that even these things that we see as natural are in fact highly socially conditioned. There's no natural high, there's a cultural processing to all of that. Question 5 is, how does the sociological understanding of culture differ from the traditional anthropological view? Traditional anthropological view is generally saying that culture is everything. Culture is all kinds of practices, is family structures, etc. Sociology looks at culture as just the meaningful side of society, just the symbols in society. Question 6 is, what is cultural relativity? This is, really kind of nuts and bolts basic sociological perspective here. Even beyond the sociology of culture, you really should know what cultural relativity is, and that is this notion that you judge a cultural practice based upon the culture in which it is situated. And I guess really kind of broadly, you have to situate practices in order to understand them. There's lots of terrible examples. I mean, but I guess a good example that Griswold gives us is the business card thing, that it means something different to give somebody your business card in Japan versus in the United States, and you really have to, you have to think about what is Japanese culture about if you're going to try to understand what that weird business card thing is about. Question 7 is, what kinds of agents, identify the kind of agents who occupy one of the filters in Hirsch's model of the culture industry. Most people did not get this. Hirsch's model of the culture industry is on page something of Griswold here. Is on page 74 in Griswold, and I can just do that. That's what it, is it backwards for you though too? So, okay, that doesn't really help. Okay, but basically your major filters, filter 1 is like A&R people in music or talent scouts, whether the creators make it into the industry. Filter 2 is between the managerial subsystem and the institutional subsystem, between organizations and the media. So does the media pick up on things? And then finally, there's a third filter. Does culture reach the consumers? And I do think that for thinking about mass-produced culture, especially, those are important things to bear in mind. Okay, hold on a second. I'm just going to change my view of things. Okay, now I can see all of you now. Okay, I'm not sure. It's very strange. I know, I'm sure it's very strange for you. It's very strange for me, not having the actual people sitting in chairs. I am still, by the way, I'm in the classroom. Right. And you're not there, but the whiteboard is, and that's why I'm doing this here and not in my office. So you'll be able to, hopefully, you'll be able to read what I write up on the board in a moment. Finally, the last short answer question was, what is a structural fold? And you recall that, hopefully, from the Video Gamers article. Again here, it's not to make a fetish of particular concepts or of, I certainly don't really care, I guess. I don't really care if you become video game producers or really want to know about how to make a video game, but to know rather that things about social structure can arguably strongly influence the production of cultural objects, right? So the thing with the structural fold is when you have, I'll try this on the board here. When you have group A and group B, and I'm not sure also, if this is necessarily the greatest metaphor, because again, I'm not sure that is that a fold? It's more like a structural overlap, right? But this is what they're calling a structural fold, and having those structural foldings, is that visible to you? Let me see. Is that yes or no? Okay. Okay, I'll try to find a darker pen for before I move on. Okay, so right, but it's the over, right? If this is group A and this is group B, then there's the structural fold there, where there's a few people who unite the two different groups. Again, I don't necessarily need you to know how that works in video games, but they have this idea that production of culture is in some way dependent upon the actual networks of people who use Google Paint. Oh no, I'm learning enough here. The structural fold, if there are people who are overlapping, that's going to influence their ability to make different things. The particular finding in that article, of course, being that when there are structural folds like this, you're more likely to get innovation because you're bringing disparate people together. Okay, and then the essays. Like I say, I'm trying to get these scanned for you. It might take a little bit of time, but I guess I would just say in general with the essays. And again, some of them were excellent. Some of them had problems. Answer all parts of the prompt. Probably give a paragraph to each question that's in the prompt. So, like for example, question 1 was Griswold refers to some theories as reflection theories of culture. What entity in these different theories is reflecting what other entities? The thing there, that's a paragraph, right? What entities are reflecting what other entities? And specifically here, we're saying, is culture reflecting social structure, or does social structure reflect different aspects of culture? So explain that. What major theorists could be considered advocates of reflection theory? And then, you want to get into the Marx, the Weber, the Lowenthal, the Keister, etc. Discuss those. How are they applied to different cultural objects is the next question. So paragraph 1, how people apply them to cultural objects. And then finally, are there viable theories of culture that are not reflection theories? And if so, how do those theories look at cultural objects? And there you might want to look at like the culture industry articles that we discussed towards the end there, right before the midterm. Again, though, everybody's kind of had different individual issues and successes with the midterm. So hopefully we get you copies emailed. Hopefully in the next week. But as with everything, we're not holding our, do hold your breath when you're walking in public, but otherwise, we're not holding our breath for administrative things to work out so well these days. Okay, so now my printer's not working why should anything work? So I am going to do what? I am going to be looking at my monitor, so I'm not going to be looking at you. So I'll be trying to come back and forth to the chat as I do this. Can I open that up? Okay, and let me see if there's a pen that's dark enough to see. Okay. Can you read that? There it is. A little, yes. Okay. All right. I just have to make sure not to put my head in the way. I can scoot it a little bit. And scoot it closer to and let me see where my lines are. I have to be from there. Here, okay. I can start there and I can go all the way to about here. All right, cool. I'm going a little further on that side. Grand. Okay, so what we are trying to get into today, and I will say along the way, there are some always issues, gaps with how much Griswold presents versus what's going on out in the field. And of course, there's been a little bit of evolution, certainly in the field since Griswold was writing about this, like 4 or 5 years ago now. But the issues here are social problems and identity. And the broadest point here is that we want to think of the social problem as a cultural construct. And of course, those of you who have taken That's not flipped for you, right? Is that flipped? Can you read? Is it going the right direction? You can read it. Okay, thank you. Because it's flipped for me. I guess that's just what they, I don't, yeah, what, technology. Okay, sorry. Right, so if you've taken social problems, you're aware this is kind of a fundamental idea about social problems is that plenty of things that are objectively problematic are not construed as social problems. People don't think of them as social problems. The driving itself, right? Driving itself is an incredibly deadly, risky proposition, right? Even, I mean, I guess even with respect to coronavirus, right? Coronavirus is going to kill, however many people it's going to kill, and it's horrible. And obviously, we're constructing it as a social problem at this point. Driving still kills more people in a given year, but we don't construe that as a social problem. We still think, we got to drive. Whatever traffic fatalities come along are just par for the course. That's just life as an American. So driving itself is not a social problem. That's just one example of this idea that any social problem has to be socially constructed. People have to arrive at this definition that, okay, X is a problem. Now, what Griswold goes on to say, though, and this is where I think she starts to maybe get into a bit of trouble, at least with me, is that she asserts that a problem depends on an identity. That in order to construe something as a social problem, some group has to identify with each other and construe it as a problem for themselves. And it can be, I think she's recognizing it can be fairly broad. Immigrant rights and that would be the social problem, and then Latinos and their allies would be the identity. Where I really run into a sort of a problem with making this link between identity and social problem is while there are certainly social problems that do inexorably have that link, there are some problems that affect such a broad swath of society or an entire society where I feel that an emphasis on identity is really not productive, doesn't give us any additional analytical purpose. So when you have a really wide group of affected people, I would not argue that you have necessarily any kind of salient identity. So that's not necessarily to say that people, political actors may not try to sort of create salient identities around these problems, but just generally speaking, especially from the purposes of analyses, this is not the most productive way necessarily to think about it. On the other hand, there are certain kinds of identities. Again, immigrant rights and Latinos would be one. Black Lives Matter movement, certainly LGBTQ issues, right, that do call upon the production of particular collective identities as a prerequisite to perceiving things as social problems. This goes all the way back, by the way, to Marx. And some of you may recall Marx's conception of the revolution was dependent upon what he called the notion of class for itself. Right, that not only do you have a group of people who are objectively faced with the same social problem, and in his case, obviously, it's mostly about really low-wage labor. Not only other people who are facing that, but they recognize that they're all in the same boat. They exist as a class of people for themselves. They have a group identity. They come together in things like union halls. They understand the social problem that they're facing, and they understand that they have to work together because they share identity to solve that social problem. Historically, in the study of movements, we talk about a lot of this, the movement from these really big kind of class-based concerns to now, and I think this is more or less where Griswold was really coming from. The concern more now is with new social movements that are more identity-based. So these are everything, again, from things like Black Lives Matter to vegans, right? What's really important is who we as members of the movement are to how we're going to perceive these social problems. So she goes into quite a bit here, and I think this is, as with anything in a reader like this, you're going to get a little bit of a kitchen sink approach. The study of identity in and of itself can be divorced from the movement's perspective. And so there are plenty of people who study identity as such, right? The real interest to certain sociologists is how do people maintain a sort of identity. And so a key thing to recognize here as well is that identity is itself a process. First of all, we should understand that certain identities are not, or perhaps all identities, no identities are given. But there are certainly certain identities that we can see historically coming into formation, even in recent history. So with respect to the LGBTQ rights movement, this is, in a sense, a really new identity. The sense that different groups of people with very different sexual practices who may not really have known each other, certainly before the late 1960s, who had very limited opportunities for embracing any kind of public identity, and in the post-Stonewall era, you see these folks embracing a kind of a common identity. The thing to note, though, here is it is at some point invented, probably collectively invented, although I suppose there are some, I'm not being able to think of one off the top of my head. There may be some identities where people say, hey, we're all gonna die. Maybe something like the Jonestown cult. He's like, oh, you're all the people's family. Where then Jim Jones could be this one person who says like, ah, yes, you are members of the family. I'm trying to think like, did Trump really construct his followers in this way? Maybe, but usually we're talking about a collective cultural process here. This happens, in conversations or in the press, where people come together and realize that they share something in common that gives them a particular collective identity. So it's invented, and also importantly, it's always in process. It's always, I guess you could say, becoming. It's never once and for all, and of course that goes along with real contentions over what. Let me close a blind here so there's less reflection there, if I can figure that out. There's a contention over what counts as being a member of a particular identity. And so, there have been, of course, disputes within the LGBTQ community as to sort of who can embrace that identity. I don't know if you guys follow. Do you follow RuPaul's Drag? Didn't help very much. Do you follow RuPaul's Drag Race? You just say yes or no. No. Okay, nobody follows. Okay, if you did, you'd see that. Okay, thank you, Jake. There's some contention over whether this is really, a legitimate expression of an LGBTQ identity, or whether in fact they're doing some kind of retrograde thing where they shouldn't count as part of the community because of the way that they do trans identities really shouldn't count. I'm certainly not to get involved in that debate, but to see, as sociologists, we should recognize that those kinds of debates are always happening, with respect to identity. Close one or two more windows and see if I can solve this reflection thing. moving on from there, God, still didn't do it. All right, I give up. Moving on from there, the thing to recognize, or the thing that Griswold wants us to certainly recognize, is that we've come to a point, and this is one of these things of where I would kind of generally say sociologists are terrible at prediction. So one of the things that we predicted, especially, was a few related processes. She puts it down as, and this maybe sounds a little, I don't know, happy, dippy, touchy feely, that there would be a global village. I think this is really kind of its moment is past in some respects, right? So there was talk about the global village in the 90s, in the aughts, and you read some of the human rights stuff from back then, and it's like, oh, we all share a common humanity, and we'll all hold hands and sing Kumbaya someday. That never really, obviously, happened. The idea with the global village would basically be, an erasure of especially ascriptive and nationalistic and religious identities. Of course, this is, a big part of, sorry, I'm watching the campus is weird now because you all aren't here. The animals are taking over, and there's a vulture going to town on something just outside the window here. So that's, I don't know, that's weird. Sorry. The prediction from Weber and others, would be, eventually these old kinds of, sometimes we call them tribalisms, these ways of relating to each other, would go away as we all kind of become more scientifically oriented people, as we all recognize, our common humanity. Of course, that has not so much happened. And part of the question is, or maybe the salient question for us is, why has that not happened? And some explanations. I'm going to hope that you're keeping up to the extent that you want to, but again, this is all recorded, so if you go back with a bigger monitor and catch some of this stuff at a later point, you'll always be able to do that. And I guess I should tell you how to do that. At some point after the class session ends today, I'll get emailed a file of this, and then it'll take me some time. I have to upload that to YouTube. I'll post a link on Moodle later to the YouTube of today's session and subsequent sessions. Okay, all right. So why haven't identities really, and again, some, in some respects, really local, small identities, religious identities, certainly all this like non-scientific kind of stuff, this non-pan-human identity, why hasn't that come across? One just kind of basic abstract explanation. it's a low cost psychological reward. And I think she's saying this, it's sort of in the abstract, we as human beings, and this, this again is maybe one of those things that requires us to think a little bit in terms of evolutionary biology, even. So I've heard different things, and I'm not sold on any of these necessarily, but ideas that like the ideal size of a human group is 50 people or 60 or 20 or whatever the numbers are, because there is arguably something innate to us about wanting to have some kind of tribal connection. We want to be connected to other human beings, but not too many. Like 50 or 60 sounds good. So you'll see that, you guys, you do this, or at least folks who do this. It's like, we're the people of Kappa, right? And, you've got your own little group identity. It feels good. It feels good. This is a low cost psychological reward to have some kind of identity that you can draw on. And again, some people argue that this maybe sort of have an upper bound of 50 or 60 people, but certainly you'll see people like, on the negative side of things, like white supremacists, who are like, yes, I feel good in my whatever Celtic, freakish, hateful identity that I come to. Having something to cling on to like that is pleasant and pleasurable. So this is all under, I guess, the rubric of why identity persists. A, it comes with a low-cost psychological reward. B, it engages a set of intellectual leaders who have higher stakes in perpetuating the identity. What the hell? Okay. Intellectual leaders with stakes. Stakes, S-T-A-K-E, not E-A, stakes. If you are, religions are probably the easiest one to pick here. If you are the Pope, not that any of us will ever be the Pope, but if you ever become the Pope, this will be a problem that you have to think about. How do you keep on poping? And the way to keep on poping is to have a bunch of people who continue to identify as Catholics. And of course, that's not just the Pope. That goes down all the way through the cardinals and the bishops down to your local parish priests. They have an intellectual stake. They have real sort of material stakes in wanting people to continue to identify as Catholics. As there are also, really certainly within any social movements, there are intellectual leaders whose, raison d'etre, their reason for being, and again, their material support in life is dependent upon having a group of people who continue to identify in a certain way. So if you are a leader at PETA, you have a really strong interest in, you can actually see it fairly explicitly in PETA about, things like saying that, vegetable eating is sexy, and making those kinds of appeals, say that like to be a non-meat eater, to be somebody who doesn't wear fur is a good thing. They're really trying to craft this animal rights as identity. Certainly, I have no doubt they have legitimate intellectual bases to their arguments, but part of that is to do with their own personal stake
in the movement or in the group. And then finally, of course, there are plenty of other reasons, but these are three major reasons why identity persists. Finally, they are easy and convenient for political leaders to draw upon. And this, I would say, is somewhat craven, even in certain times. So you'll see, as we are in an election year, you can see, I presume Joe Biden will make a trip to Miami at some point. Well, will he? I don't know. Coronavirus just fucks everything up. If it was a normal election year, Joe Biden would go to Miami at some point and make some appeals to the Cubans and other Latinos in Miami, say a few words in Spanish, and do that as an appeal specifically to those identities. You see that certainly as well. It just in any major national election, as politicians try to absorb or get as many votes as they can, they try to make these appeals to different identities. I'm even thinking, even Trump, right? There's no group that he in election day, there's no group of voters who he specifically sets out to alienate. He does a good job of alienating any number of people, but he tries at least to get everybody to love him. So I'm just remembering the rallies that he would have in 2016, and he's like, oh, where's my black? Because I can appeal to black voters as well based on their identities. And of course, it doesn't necessarily really work out for him, but every politician is trying to do this. And in so doing, they are reinvigorating those identities. They get other political leaders and other group leaders to really say, this is salient, and even to get, in some cases, material support on the basis of identity. So all of this is a very long-winded way of saying, identity matters. Identity is crafted. Identity is perhaps sometimes craven, but it is this process that remains. There we go. Okay. Let me see. So then I want to just talk to the issue of social problems a little bit more specifically in the time that we have remaining. So again, Griswold's making this argument, and I don't necessarily know that we really need to take it too much to heart, making the argument that problems always appeal to particular identities. Again, certain things, sure, the problems that specifically face the African-American community, the Latino community, etc. Yeah, having identity is really salient to that. Certain kinds of things, though, COVID-19, that's everybody, that's worldwide, that's no particular kind of identity. And I don't think, certainly you will see some appeals to, oh, well, it affects old people, and so everybody has grandparents, and isn't that horrible, blah, 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 blah. But really, this is beyond identity. So we can, I think, talk about problems in a more abstract sense. And specifically, what we have to remember, again, problems are constructed, they are cultural objects, and they change with time. I don't know if you have your Moodle open. I guess it doesn't really matter to me though, because I can just do this. If you look at, for example, any Florida legislative session, or really any legislative session of any government body, what you will find is that they emphasize certain things as social problems at the expense of others. Because basically what a legislature is, in a sense, is a group of people trying to solve certain social problems. What they will emphasize, though, are the problems that appear salient to them in that day. So I'm going to show you now, and I've linked it on Moodle. Present my entire screen. Okay, so now I'm sharing. What would I like to share? I'd like to share that. I'm sharing that. All right, I'm presenting my screen, and here is, again, this is linked on Moodle, the bills that died, the 12 dead issues from the 2020 Florida legislative session. And this just kind of gives you a sense that certain things seem problematic to society, to politicians, and presumably their constituents. Certain do not. The first thing to remember here as we look at this is that if this stuff even makes the list, then somebody perceives it as problematic. So gambling, sometimes perceived as a social problem, sometimes not. Although this one, the particular thing is that the kind of a gambling deal that we have with the Seminole tribe. The Seminoles don't like the situation, I guess you'd say, with gambling. Here it is, they would like to have more legalized sports betting. That's a social problem from their perspective. It rose enough to the level to be presented to the legislature, but not enough that the legislature actually did anything about it. Marijuana potency, there's a good one though. Some people perceive that sorry, I mean, it seems a little silly. Everything seems a little silly in the times of coronavirus, but that we need to put a cap on the amount of THC in medical marijuana because, God forbid, kids who need medical marijuana get too stoned from it. But, again, this shows some group thought that rose to the level of a social problem. Overall, it did not make the cut. Neither did having a moment of silence in schools. Neither did this one's a little close to home here, although not exactly. But whether or not oh gosh, this is confusing. Whether or not to make more openness in searching for presidents of universities, of colleges and universities. Some people say, "Oh, that's a big problem. We should know who they're picking." And certainly there's some legitimate concern. Are they picking from a diverse pool of candidates, et cetera, et cetera. But again, the overall point here being that different things rise to the level of what will be a social problem. And again, you can visit that through the Moodle now or later if you wish. So the other thing to look at here, though, is certainly there's some organic creation. I'll call it organic. That's not really the best word for it. But this is what you would call the grassroots. at some point, Black Lives Matter is a great example of this. People recognize a certain problem. Members of the community recognized that the police treatment of African Americans was problematic. And so there is this grassroots organizing towards recognizing that problem and doing things, media activism on Twitter, or physical activism in protests and that sort of a thing. But the point that a lot of students of social problems have really focused on is that there is a large role for the media here. And at kind of the broadest level, the question for the media is about carrying capacity. What carrying capacity is this concept that basically there are only so many things that the news media can take on any given day. And this, I should note, this is evolving stuff. And social media is problematizing all of this in new ways, but still you can see your parents, your grandparents are watching, whether it's Fox News or CNN, or whether they're reading the newspaper. Certainly with traditional media, you can only present so many problems. So the media can only pay attention to so many problems. One last point. As we just saw, you can only craft so many bills. I would encourage you, if you're not already, if you haven't already watched the new Netflix documentary, the Tiger King. There's a, yes, good. There is briefly in the first episode of that, she addresses one of the characters, addresses lobbying, and that is a real issue. So lobbying and getting people to pay attention to your problem. Okay, we're at full time today. I know you've all got other things to get onto, so enjoy your social distances. Stay 6 feet away from everybody or further. Hopefully, Sophia joins us and we'll talk about Nazis on Wednesday, but if not, I'll be leading that discussion again. So I'm going to sign off now. I'm glad you could all join us. And if you have questions, issues, again, just shoot me an email and I'll deal with that. Okay? All right. Have a good day.